Hey everyone, Sparrow here, and today I want to talk about the difference between borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. And it's really a challenging topic because they almost always go hand in hand. And when we look at borderline personality and we look at narcissistic personality, they both fall under axis 2 personality disorders. And a lot of times when somebody has one personality disorder, they tend to have another one. And sometimes they have histrionic, these are called the cluster B personality disorders. A lot of times they'll have all three, histrionic, borderline, and narcissism. And then you've got a real treat on your hands, right? Anyway, some of the similarities, of course, are the unstable identities. Right? So people with borderline and people with narcissistic personality disorder, which I'll just call NPD, they have very unstable identities. They don't know who they are deep down. Their identity is propped up by other people around them, so mostly their interpersonal relationships, or sometimes the fantasies in their head. So they might watch TV shows or movies or read books and say, I want to be like this person. And they might even act like that person. They might buy what that person buys. For instance, if they're watching reality shows like Real Housewives or Kardashians, they might really think, if we're talking about a woman, that they need to have that Louis Vuitton bag because otherwise they don't know who they are. They're that person that has to have the bag. Now, I'm not saying everyone who has a designer handbag has borderline or narcissism, but these are people who really buy into this stuff. They're looking for an external identity because they haven't really formed one. And a lot of times they haven't formed one because they had a very strong, authoritative, controlling parent in their development somewhere that didn't allow them to individuate, didn't allow them to explore, to make their own decisions, to experiment with things like, hair, clothing, that kind of thing. And so they really got stunted and didn't form an identity. And so, or a lot of times too, those parents sometimes coddled, not always, but sometimes they coddled and did everything for their kids. So here, let me tie your shoes, let me cut your steak, let me do all of this, and then didn't really allow that person to develop. So you've got somebody entering out into adulthood who doesn't have a stable identity. So both of those disorders are marked by people with unstable identities. They're also both quick to anger. So a borderline personality disorder, when they don't get their way, they'll throw a tantrum, right? That person will throw a tantrum. A narcissist will also often throw a tantrum. They will yell, they'll intimidate. You'll see both of these people yelling at service people, yelling at wait staff, and demanding things, feeling their sense of importance and entitlement. These people are both entitled. Both an MPB and a BPD will love you one minute and hate you the next. And that's called vacillating between idealization and devaluation. So one minute they'll think you're the greatest thing, but you blink funny or you breathe wrong, and all of a sudden you're the worst person on the planet. They hate you, and you're the cause of all of their life's problems, and they'll go into a tirade about it. And it's quite exhausting if you're in a relationship or have a family member with one of these disorders, because there's no trust and there's no stability in the environment. So you end up walking on eggshells. And there was a great book written about borderline personality disorder by, I think, Randy Krieger, called Walking on Eggshells, because that's what ends up happening. These people are hair triggers, both of them really. I would say the borderline even more so of a hair trigger. They have no emotional regulation, right? They can't take a deep breath and go, okay, this stinks, but, I'll cope. They really have no coping skills. I would say the borderline more so than the NPD, but not a lot more, maybe a little more, will tend towards the addictions. But you'll see the borderline, really tending towards drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, social media. They'll have lots of soft addictions and at least one or two hard addictions. And typically a borderline personality will tend to overshop and overspend. They're impulsive. Narcissists can be impulsive too, but they have a little more, they tend to anyway, have a little more self-control. And I think the reason for this is because they're more manipulative and calculating. Whereas the borderline, they do manipulate, but they're much more impulsive. So a narcissist can really take their time, whining you and dining you, and sucking you in slowly. And the borderline can do that too, but early on with the borderline, you're going to see more tantrums. You're going to see more bad behavior. You'll see a lot more crying with the borderline, yelling, screaming, crying, throwing things, all of that stuff. And what I see in my practice typically is the men tend to gravitate more towards narcissism, and the females tend to gravitate more towards the borderline personality, although that's not always the case. And like I said, the two can commingle quite nicely because, the hallmark of both of these is that sense of entitlement. I have to meet my needs first and foremost all the time, and my needs matter and the rest of the world really don't. And even with their children, they'll meet their kids' needs to a degree, but they're still going to always come first. And I would say both narcissist and borderline personality tend to use guilt quite a bit, especially with their kids, right? Because they can get away with it. But they'll guilt, they'll manipulate, they sulk. The borderline will go from being happy one moment to throwing a meltdown fit the next moment to then sulking. I mean, he or she will use any tactic to get their way. And they're quite relentless. Now, the narcissist will engage in conflict, but they don't thrive on conflict as much as they thrive on getting what's called narcissistic supply. And that is admiration and attention and love. That's really what they thrive on, right? The borderline personality actually thrives on conflict. So out of the two, I would say the borderline personality has even more self-loathing, if that's possible, but I think it is. They have more self-loathing than the narcissist because the borderline will take a perfectly good moment or day and ruin it just to have the conflict. It's almost like that's what they feed on. They don't feed on as much positive attention because it kicks up their shame and self-loathing. They feed on the conflict to reinforce just that awfulness that they feel almost all of the time. Whereas the narcissist will really beam and feed on the narcissistic supply and the attention. Now, as far as self-harm and suicidal ideation, you're going to see a lot more of that with the borderline personality. And again, that just goes back to that intense self-loathing. You don't see as much of that with the narcissist. Although if their rug is completely pulled out from underneath them, who knows, they could possibly have a suicide attempt or engage in some self-harm. That doesn't happen as often as it happens with the borderline. And if you do pull the rug out from underneath a narcissist, they quickly regain their footing and they'll go get their narcissistic supply from someone else. So they typically have a list of people who, they can go and get that attention and get that supply. The borderline personality is going to be much more likely to engage in those self-harm behaviors and suicidal ideation and also they're more prone to threaten them too. So a lot of times with the borderline personality, they'll use suicide as a way to manipulate you. And you'll see this a lot oftentimes, unfortunately, in teenage girls especially. And sometimes you can tell that they're little budding borderlines. Unfortunately, we don't diagnose that at that age typically, but it doesn't happen magically when a person turns 18. These are behaviors and patterns that exist for years and go on into adulthood. So, bottom line, a narcissist and a borderline can be one and the same person and often are. That sense of entitlement is key. the desire and ability to manipulate is key. You know, getting their needs met first is key. But yeah, they don't always overlap, but they often do. So if you are in a relationship with a borderline or with a narcissistic personality, my condolences. It's very tough. It's very tough. And I suggest that you get your own professional help. There's a lot of help out there, and really assess and see, is this the relationship for you? And it can be messy when you have kids with people with access to personality disorders. It's so challenging. So my heart goes out to you if that's you. So anyway, if you like this video, please click below on the birdcage and subscribe. And you can check out my website, sparrowspalding.com, for my books and other information. And oh, by the way, my latest book is called Uncaged: Trauma Recovery Using Facet Integration Technique. And I'm really excited to share this. It just came out. It's my technique, and based on facet theory, which is my theory. And trauma recovery is near and dear to my heart because I'm also not just a professional, I'm also a trauma survivor. And so yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. And as always, hug yourself from me, and we'll see you next time.